Right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our normal Monday evening show. Thanks very much for tuning in. We're putting this one out pretty much across the known universe. So I think we're on the YouTubes, the Facebooks, the X's, Getters, Rumbles, etc., etc. So wherever you're watching the show, anyway, listen. Thanks very much for coming along and supporting us here. Appreciate that. I know there's always so much choice about, but hopefully what you get here makes it worth your while. So thank you for that. First thing I just want to also flag up is don't forget that we have our live event in London on the 12th of September, and that is going to be featuring, amongst others, Mr. Andrew Bridgen, former MP, who is a really interesting guy. Lots of fascinating insights from Andrew. So Andrew's going to be joining Peter McElvenna and myself. And in addition to that, hi there, Chris Davies. Good to see you, my friend. We'll also have a guy called Billboard Chris. I don't know if you know Billboard. Have you heard of Billboard Chris? You should check him out on X. He's a guy who is basically fighting a lot of the trans ideology. So come along, Liberty Unlocked on the 12th of September. It's a Friday night in London town. Bring a stab vest and we'll all have a great time. It'll all be good. Don't worry about it. It's all going to be fine. Yes, Chris Davies, he's from Canada. It's an international gathering. What can I say? We hope to have more announcements as well. But the tickets are now available. It's Friday evening. Starts at 7, I think, round about then, 7:30. And best of all, there's a bar. In fact, I think there's 2 bars, but there's definitely 1 bar. So come along to see us live. I promise us, Chris Davies, it's definitely going to be live. Charlie, it's definitely going to be live. So come along, and I promise I won't bite. I can't speak for the other ones, but I'll bite. You'll be okay with me, and we'll have a good night. And then the following day, Saturday the 13th, of September. That's Tommy Robinson's big event in London, which I hope to be at as well. So there's a couple of dates for your diary, just over a month away. So make sure if you can get there that you will be there for both. I'm just seeing some questions here coming in, right? Yeah, Ultron. I know Privy Council. Yeah, I know about the Privy Council. Yeah, right. So, hey, listen. So let's start at the top. I've got a great guest. I want to bring him in now. Now, for those of you of my vintage, you may remember a song that was a big hit back. It was number 1 back in 1975, I think it was, something like that. It was by Mud, and it was called "Lonely This Christmas." Do you remember "Lonely This Christmas" by Mud? Oh yeah. Well, the guy I'm going to bring on now, I'm going to introduce you to, he did a great satire or pastiche on it, or he can describe it to you, called "Freezing This Christmas." And that all links into the BBC and stuff that I want to talk about. So he's been sitting there very patiently as I waffle. But without any further ado, please welcome Mr. Chris Middleton. Chris.
Hi, David.
Greetings. Hi, good to have you with us, Chris. Thanks very much for giving us your time this Monday evening. So, yeah, I mean, first of all, there's Chris's handle. You can check him out over at X. Make sure you follow him. Make sure you support him. All the usual stuff. Please do that. Somebody says I was 5 when it came out. How dare you, Ultron, make me feel old? You're too young to remember first time around anyway. But actually, Chris, but this was a great thing that was done last sort of November, December, wasn't it? The freezing this Christmas. So we'll start there and then we'll dive into the BBC. But tell us about how that sort of, because it was a single. It was if they have singles nowadays, it's a download.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the download single. Yeah, so it all started. Well, I suppose really it kind of all started with the last election last July. Labour got in, obviously, after sort of 14 years of the Tories being terrible. And I think a lot of people were just hoping for something different, something maybe they might do 1 or 2 bad things maybe, but hopefully it won't be too bad. It'll be a change at least. And then I think pretty quickly everyone realised, oh, bloody hell, this is a hell of a lot more worse than we thought. And the thing that always annoys me the most about anything, whether it's politicians, the media, the BBC, anything, It's lying. It's telling untruths. And obviously, this Labour government has done a lot of that. And one of the first things they did when they got into power, just 3 weeks after getting into power, was announced the cut to the winter fuel allowance. Now, that wasn't in the manifesto. There was no talk about anything like that happening at all in the run-up to the election. In fact, Keir Starmer even put out a tweet on the day of the election talking about how he would support the pensioners and never betray them and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. So just add that to the list of lies. So 3 weeks into the government, they announced this cut to save about £1.5 billion. I think it ended up being less. And it just, to me, it just didn't really sit right. It seemed kind of pointless. A small amount of money to be saved to annoy a hell of a lot of people. Yeah. Of course, older people typically tend to vote Conservative. So you could see perhaps why they would maybe aim that, whether it was actually to save money or just as kind of an FU. Who really knows? But I think, like a lot of people, that kind of really annoyed me. And then obviously the government went on and continued to just make disastrous decision after disastrous decision. Then sort of October time came around, and I can't remember exactly what it was. I think I saw a post or something on X, someone saying that someone should do a Christmas song for the pensioners, basically. And I saw that, and I was kind of just thinking about it, and it just came to me because, weirdly, "Lonely This Christmas" is actually my favorite Christmas song.
Very good.
Yeah, it's a strange one, isn't it? Everyone's always thought it's really weird because it's kind of depressing and it's a little bit sad. But it's just one that I always just really enjoyed singing along to it for some reason. I just found it's just a fun song for me. So that was the first thing that I had in my head when I saw this post, and I thought, oh, "Lonely This Christmas, Freezing This Christmas." Yeah, that kind of fits. And it didn't really think much of it. And then it just sort of stuck in my head. And then my brain just started coming up with, okay, well, this could be a lyric. Oh, well, we could do this. And then all of a sudden, 24 hours later, I'd basically written the whole thing sort of in my head. And I sent it to a few friends and I said, this would be quite funny. Wouldn't it? Imagine if someone did this. And they were like, well, why don't you just do it?
Yeah.
So I thought, well, the thing is I can't sing, unfortunately. But we thought, what, these days online, you can kind of just do anything, pay someone 50 quid to sing it for you and kind of see what happens. So I just took it from there, really. Found a singer, literally paid him about 45 quid, I think it was, to sing it for me. Made it with some friends, paid another guy 50 quid or so, 60 quid, 70 quid to do the video. Fortunately, the video turned out really well.
Brilliant.
And then I finally had this thing, and I thought, well, you know what, we've got it now. Let's put it out, hopefully raise some money. Obviously, I didn't think necessarily it would go anywhere. I thought, who knows, maybe 1,000 people will see it, maybe 10,000 people will see it. That'd be kind of cool. Maybe we could raise a few hundred quid for pensioners. That'd be cool. And then all of a sudden I think you were actually one of the first people to retweet it for me on X. I don't know if you remember.
I do.
And a few other bigger accounts as well. And then from there, it just sort of got traction. And then it was just kind of out of my hands, really. And it just kind of took off and had this whole life of its own. It was a bit of a whirlwind experience.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, it's sort of in the background there. You saw it. And the thing that struck me when you made me aware of it, Chris, the lyrics are very poignant. Of course, there was huge anger about what they were doing, the government to the pensioners, but the video was beautiful, and it was a faithful version of "Lonely This Christmas" with your lyrics. So tell us how well did it do then? Did it get to number one?
Yeah, so it did. I mean, it did remarkably well, really, considering I just did this. I was just sort of winging it the entire time. I've never done anything like this before. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. It was kind of just like the blind leading the blind through the whole thing, really. I mean, I ended up just devoting a lot of time to it, trying to push it and do as many media appearances and all sorts that I could. Yeah. In the end, I think there's definitely some mistakes that I made that if I was to do another one now, it certainly could have been done better to maybe get that extra push to get it higher in the charts actually for Christmas. But in the end, we got to, we topped the download chart for 3 weeks in a row. We topped the official sales chart 3 weeks in a row. The issue now, of course, these days is that most of the sort of chart position comes from streams. And around Christmas, what happens is a lot of people, they'll just put on like a Christmas playlist on Spotify or something like that, just in the background, not even listening to a particular song. But those songs that are in the playlists, they just get millions and millions of views just naturally from just being on in those playlists. So when it actually comes to the overall charts, which includes the streams, we only ended up actually coming 37th in the end, but still top 40, which meant that the BBC did have to mention us in the actual top 40 chart countdown. Of course, they didn't play the song, and they tried to just move past it as quickly as possible.
No, moving on quite swiftly. I can see, I'm being told here, it got 2.7 million views over on YouTube. So
that many now?
Wow. 2.7 million, yeah. So I mean, that's a fantastic success, and the timing was just brilliant because the lyric that you wrote pertinent to what the government had done and how pensioners were affected. I mean, it could have been worse because the weather could have been even colder, but it was still a horrible thing to do. So well done. And I was very happy to, Chris, be one of the first to get it out there for you. And I know others joined in. And I can imagine the BBC having a meeting about it, saying, like, this is a problem. This guy's a problem. But tell us then, yourself and the BBC. So you're an independent journalist, right? But
no,
I understand you are now, yeah. But previously, previous to Phrasing This Christmas, did you work for the BBC?
That's right, yeah. So I freelanced for the BBC for about 7 years, basically. So when I first did the song, or when I first sort of came up with the idea and decided to put it out, I obviously was aware that doing something this sort of political wasn't going to go very well for someone who's a broadcast journalist at the BBC. So my initial plan was to just put it out anonymously, which I did, which is why I had the whole band name and Sistama and the Granny Hammers and all this. And I just tried to keep it because I didn't know how well it would do. For all I knew, it was just going to get 1,000 views and it would just peter out into nothing. I could just maintain my anonymity and just continue doing my freelance work without any issues. And then once it did start, it initially started to pick up on X, as we say, thanks to yourself and some other people. And that's when I then started getting offers for to do media appearances. And the first one being with Martin Daubney on GB News. And if you know anything about the BBC, it's if you say the words GB News, they treat you like you're a vampire. It's all of like the Antichrist all of a sudden. Exactly. Stay away. It's actually quite funny just to see it. So once I got that sort of offer, I was still anonymous and I hadn't told the BBC at this point. And I just thought, you know what, it's starting to get some traction now. It's a couple of weeks away from Christmas. This is either the chance now to kind of push it to sort of the heights it could be, or if I don't push it, it might continue to still do okay, but it's obviously not going to do as well as if I actually get on the TV and start talking about it. And to do that, really, I need to put a face to it. So I did deliberate over it for a couple of days because it was, it was quite a nerve-wracking thing to do, really. Like my normal life before this was quite quiet, quite private. I am quite a private person generally. I like to keep myself to myself. But I thought, you know what, I'd received so many messages from pensioners, from families, thanking me for doing this and telling me their stories. It's heartbreaking to read it. I mean, you can go on the YouTube video now and there's literally thousands and thousands of comments from people, like 99% of them are positive, thanking me for doing the song. And I just felt morally obligated to do it, basically to push it, knowing that obviously if I put my name out there, I would lose my job at the BBC. To be honest, I wasn't that bothered because, as we can get into, I was kind of disillusioned with the BBC anyway and had been for some time. So in a way, it was kind of a win-win for me ultimately because it sort of allowed me to go out with a bit of a bang.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, you were, as you say, working as you were independent journalist, working contracted to the BBC. So tell us what's it like in the BBC? Because I've got to say, just chatting before we came on air, I used to spend quite a lot of time actually trotting in and out of the BBC headquarters in Belfast, but they would interview me until they finally decided we've had enough of him. He's a far right Nazi extremist, homophobe, Islamophobe, homophobe, and so they banned me across the network. Actually, not just Belfast, across all BBC, and then that went broader, across Sky and all the rest of it. But I do blame the BBC. But in retrospect, it was I felt really happy. It was a release not to have to endure the bias that I suffered all the time. Every interview was weighted,
Yeah.
but you would have seen it from the other side working in the BBC. Was the bias obvious to you, Chris? And what did you think when you encountered it?
Yeah, well, it was to me, because the thing with bias, right, is it's you don't everyone is biased, right? Everyone is obviously biased towards their own opinions, because otherwise you wouldn't have those opinions. They're the things that you believe are to be correct, right? Obviously. So in the BBC, bias, it's almost like a fish in water. Fish don't know what water is, right? They're swimming in it all the time.
Yeah.
And if you ask a fish what's water, they'll say, what is water? I've got no idea, because they don't know, because it's like, to us, what's air? It's just everywhere. So I always describe it like this: like, a lot of people, especially people that have never worked in the media, they like to always go to this sort of conspiratorial angle that the news is sort of controlled from someone on high. There's like a big guy at the BBC who's saying, no, do this, do this, do this, do this. And it's all coming up from on high, and everything is sort of pre-decided. But the way it works in reality is that you just have all these fish swimming along who they're already swimming in their own bias, right? They're all basically believe this sort of general metropolitan liberal consensus.
Yes.
That they all just believe. So to them, that they don't think that's bias. So from my perspective, who's someone who's slightly to the right on a lot of issues, that is obviously starkly apparent to me, because that's not the water that I swim in. Yes. But to them, they don't notice it a lot of the time, which is why even when they think they're being impartial, like they do put a lot of effort into trying to be impartial. But the problem is, a lot of times they don't even see their own bias, because they're just so surrounded by it, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah. So I mean, I used to sit in BBC studios, and there'd be three of us. There's three of us in this relationship, right? There'd be me, there'd be the interviewer, and there'd be my opponent, right? Mm-hmm. But the problem always was, Chris, my opponent and the presenter were always ideologically aligned. And then I could see the guys in the studio through the glass, whatever. And you could see it was all a group. It's kind of group. It is the Orwellian group think. They all just think that way. And whether they are aware of them thinking that way, is maybe like the point you make. But but it was always that way. I always felt, because if I would consider my views to be centre right, nothing extreme about them at all, but you were made to feel as if you were, like a monster.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a lot of them. It's because they all sort of hold this view. And to them, that is almost like the default position, if that makes sense. So anyone that sort of is outside of that, they almost look down on, in a way, almost sort of like almost in like a pitying way, like, oh, isn't it strange? Like at the zoo, like, oh, isn't it strange to have this? Well, we have to get them on, obviously, because we do have to share the views. But everyone sort of thinks, like, they're looking at you through the glass, like, oh, this guy's a bit weird, isn't he? Like, oh, why does he think all these strange things? And they do it. They get you on because they know that they have to. They know they have to tick the box to give you due impartiality, to use Ofcom's rules or terms. Yes. They have to present both sides, as in they have to literally have someone on from both sides. But even just doing that doesn't mean that they're not being biased, because it's the way that they present it. As you say, it's the way that you get introduced onto the show, the labels that they use on people. This is one of the things that really has always annoyed me with the BBC, that I've talked about a little bit in my thread that I did on X last week, where it's even in just the labels that they use for people immediately set the stage of what their ideological position is. You see it all the time. Like I was talking about protests, where on one side you have the anti-racists, and on the other side you have the far right, which is clearly not a balanced way of explaining what the two sides are. But to them, they wouldn't even consider that to be biased. That's genuinely how they see the sides, and they think that that's a fair telling of the sides. And to me, that's just clear bias, especially because, the Stand Up to Racism and all these groups that come out counter-protesting, where they all have the placards, always the same at any protest around the country. They all seem to magically have these same placards. And it's because they're all being printed by the Socialist Workers' Party, which Stand Up to Racism is an offshoot of. And that is a far left organization. The BBC, I've never seen the BBC use the word far left to describe anyone. but you'll see them use far right all the time.
All the
And
time.
that doesn't sit right with me. They're literally communists. They literally want to overthrow capitalism. Is one of their stated goals.
But you're right, Chris. It's the BBC language, and as someone who loves language, and I've always been acutely aware of how the BBC deploy language, and they deploy it very well. They're very skilled at it, but they deploy it always in a biased fashion. So as you say, that example you've just given, stand up to racists. Well, they're kind of moderate people, and then you've got the Nazis on the other side, and that's the way. And the BBC operates across a whole spectrum of topics. But I can remember, and they love doing ambushes as well. I remember going into the studio once, BBC studio, and the presenter was there, and this was quite a few years ago when the trans issue hadn't become, the big thing that it subsequently became. And there was a trans person there. There was this individual who looked female. Now, they did look female, but I'm afraid the DNA doesn't lie. They weren't. And I remember I remember sort of thinking the stress of this for me, because the presenter kept using the pronouns, she, and even there's a bias in that. There is a bias there. And I can remember turning around and saying, well, look, this individual, look, if someone came up to me in the street, Chris, and said, I am from the planet Mars, I've told this, right? Then I would say, hi, how you doing? I hope, how's Mars? I'm not going to necessarily just contradict you, but you're not from Mars. That's not the case. But the BBC, quite prepared, even then, 10 years ago, longer, to go along with this, and they've got all their little BBC narratives going on, within. And yet, I remember going out for a coffee with a couple of the producers. Now, not the front of staff, not the talent, which is a bloody oxymoron, but the talent, not the talent, the producers. And some of them didn't seem to be too bad to me. Some of them were quite actually almost friendly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know if you found that there's a difference between the back room, as it were, and the front of camera people.
There certainly can be. I mean, it is hard to tell because, as you might imagine, like for me, as someone who, as I say, is slightly on the right of things, when certain topics come up and you're in an organization like that, and bear in mind, I was just a freelancer, and I was offered jobs there, but this is probably one of the reasons why I never took them, is because it's not a comfortable place to be, right? When you feel like everyone has a view that is against the view that you have, obviously, and they sort of look down on you in this sort of typical, it tends to be more a thing that people on the left do, right? Where they look down on you on a sort of, in a moral way. Like, it's not just that, we have a disagreement because we disagree on the facts, or we've got there through different reasoning, or we have different ideas about how a good society should be run. It's like, no, you're just a bad person, actually. That's why you believe those things, and I'm actually a morally good person. So when you're in an environment like that, what tends to happen is, and this is what I did, right? You just stay quiet to get along. I don't want to be having random arguments with people all the time. Obviously, that's not conducive to just getting on with my life quietly. So going back to your question, it's hard to tell who believes what, really, because again, you're trying to blend in with this water, right? That's there, and it's there all the time. And everyone knows it's there, and it's like any sort of, almost like, I don't want to put too fine of a point of it by calling it like a cult, but it's almost like that cult-like idea of like, you don't want to put your head above the parapet. You just want to go along, and you don't want to be singled out. You have to just go along with the narrative. So who actually believes what? It's sometimes very hard to know for sure, because you don't know who's just sort of doing what I did, and which is just staying quiet to have an easy life.
But I mean, some of the talent. I mean, I used to do a lot of stuff with Stephen Nolan, who does obviously BBC 5 Live as well as local stuff where I live. And it's pretty clear where Stephen Nolan stood on things. I used to do the 5 Live Sunday paper review, which was always a laugh, because at every given point I was always interrupted, contradicted, and made to, how can you say that? Like, I mean, basically, it was at the point, Chris, if I'd have said good morning, someone will say, well, what's so good about it then? That would be how I would be And I always find it uncomfortable. Being banned by them was a good thing, but working is a different when you're working for them, and there's contracts and stuff. That then, as you say, must make it a much more uncomfortable place. So you keep your head down, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it can be. It certainly can be. I mean, it depends what's going on at any given time, and obviously, every person is sort of different. And there definitely has been occasions when I've sort of maybe expressed a little bit more than I normally would, and people start to be like, "Oh," you start to get funny looks. People are like, "Oh, that's a bit." Oh, almost like they've never even heard anyone say. Like it is almost like they treat these sort of opinions that are outside their sort of establishment worldview as like going to the zoo. Like they look at you almost in that way, like, "Oh, this is something sort of exotic. I've heard that they exist out in the wild, but I've never actually come across it and seen it in person."
Yeah. I think that's probably it. It is kind of ultimate reinforcement group thing. But then one of the things that, like, you have people like I'm seeing here, like Victoria Derbyshire, Laura Kuenssberg, people like Gary Lineker. I mean, they're not exactly shy in showing their bias. That BBC's happy with that, though.
Yeah, well, exactly. Well, they're happy with a sort of slight left bias because, for the reasons I explained, where they don't really think that is necessarily bias. Obviously, I think Gary Lineker started to go a little bit too far off the left deep end.
Yeah.
But obviously, a sort of slight centre-left bias is, I would say, the BBC's default, which they consider to be the centre. Basically, that's what they consider to be impartial. Obviously, if you ask anyone who's on the far left, they'll tell you that the BBC is a right-wing organisation, which I always find insane. Like I've heard people call Laura Kuenssberg right-wing and things like that, which, I think that's just you're on a different planet. But generally, my opinion is that they're sort of slightly to the left, metropolitan liberal establishment bias, but to them it's not bias. That's the key thing. They genuinely don't think that it's bias. They think that that's just sort of the baseline, and that's why to them, someone like yourself who's on the right, just saying sort of normal opinions, nothing that's like crazy, nothing that's extreme or out there, but they'll look at you as though you're sort of Hitler.
Well, I mean, one of my areas of interest is economics and business. I've always been interested. I did a degree in it. I'm always interested in it, and I find again, if you spoke from an economics point of view about things like welfareism and they look at you like the creature in the zoo, because this notion that you have to live within your budget, for example, which most normal people do, and most organisations do, but BBC doesn't, Chris. The BBC rakes in 3.8 billion a year. So do you think that because of that model, which I think is an anachronistic neo-Stalinist model, does that insulate them, do you think, from being more responsive to what ordinary people think?
Yeah, definitely. And just before I talk about that, just going back to the point you just mentioned, there was an article last week, I don't know if you saw it, that OBR put out a report which was talking about how basically the economy's screwed for the next sort of 5 decades. What they basically said was we either need to cut spending or increase taxes or do both. And the BBC headline for that report was the government needs to raise taxes. So that shows you where it's to them cutting spending isn't even an option. No, you know what I mean? Like that's how they've interpreted that report, to come out and say the government needs to increase spending. So that speaks to your point about economics, right? Anyone who tries to actually understand economics and how business and money works is obviously you're more to the right? You're a capitalist. They don't even, they consider that beyond the pale. It's all statism. It's all, what more can the government do for you? How can the government be more involved in all of our lives as if we need that? But going back to your point about what was it, the funding model and the sort of
the funding, the license tax.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard. It's a hard one, isn't it? Because I do think there is a place for the BBC. I do think there is a place to have a state broadcaster to do what private news organizations can't. But this is just sort of like in theory. This in practice, obviously, this isn't what they do at all. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you look at like newspapers or you look at local radio, what's happened over the last sort of 20 years, local newspapers and local radio. And I'm sure you probably have this in Northern Ireland as well, where the local newspaper is basically just a load of crap. Like they're not doing any news at all. They're just doing like rubbish press releases. Here's something the council said, and then here's some like stupid culture story. You know, to actually find out anything that's worthwhile that's happening in your area is basically impossible these days. And that's fair enough. That's because there's no money in it anymore, right? There's no money in journalism anymore as a whole because everything's moved to online. So to operate a small local paper or a small local radio station basically just isn't viable commercially anymore. So I think there is space in that area for something like the BBC. And I think that's what the BBC should be doing. It's that sort of local stuff that isn't commercially viable. That's the only time the government should be doing things. But you would still run into the same problem, right? Which is ideological capture, which is not actually just doing the things that it's meant to do. So I think in theory, what I just explained there would be a nice idea. In practice, that probably wouldn't work anyway. But aside from all of that sort of theoretical idea, the BBC is obviously way, way, way bigger than that anyway. It's got its fingers in too many pies, in my opinion. It's trying to do all sorts of things. Like, I don't understand why the British Broadcasting Corporation is trying to compete with Netflix doing series, and it's doing BBC Pidgin in Africa, and it's like doing all this crazy stuff around the world while just not even servicing the people that it's meant to in the country.
But you talk about like local stuff, and one of the things we were chatting again, just we started this. The one thing that a lot of people are always interested in is just the weather. What's your weather like today? What's the weather forecast for tomorrow? You would sort of think that's nice and straightforward, but it's not. If I tune into the weather, Chris, I'm not going to get more than 2 sentences in before climate change is inserted in. And I'm thinking, this is just, even the weather's propaganda. You know what I mean? And how useful is that? So it's useful to know what the forecast might be, but by the same token, I can ask the internet, and it'll tell me. So, and I think this is the trouble about state broadcasters. The idea is okay. It's a bit, to be honest, Chris, it's very similar, you might think, to national sort of like national health, having a national health service model. These things are theoretically good, but it never works out because you've said it, the ideological capture happens. And I'm not sure the BBC was always as bad as it became, Chris. I'm old enough to remember it. Back in the 70s and maybe even it went into it was triggered over Margaret Thatcher, and it never recovered from that. It was triggered then, and then it was triggered under Tony Blair. It wasn't so triggered. Once Cameron and his lot got in, as you rightly observed, were useless. They were triggered again, and now they've got Starmer in. They're not just as triggered because, as you say, it's that space, isn't it? They just inhabit that's to the left. Slightly to the left space on something. Some things extremely to the left. I mean, you mentioned Gaza to the average BBC person, and they're just triggered.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, I did it just before we come on, and I mean, I do this like not necessarily every day, but a few times a week, I like to go on the BBC homepage just to see what they're talking about, and pretty much 9 times out of 10 for the past 2 years, or at least last year, it's 5 stories about Gaza, it's 5 stories about Donald Trump, and then it's like 1 story about the UK that's about something completely some nonsense that you don't care about, and then maybe 1 story about Starmer doing something that like it's their priorities are absolutely insane considering they're supposed to be the national broadcaster of the country. Most people just want to know what's going on. Immediately in their local area, anything important happening in the local area. And then what are the big things happening in the country? Any big crimes? How's the government screwing us today? And that's pretty much it. War, fair enough. Like people are interested in war, but do we need 5 stories about it? Do we need constant rolling coverage about what's going on in Gaza? I mean, how many wars are there going on at any given moment? There's probably 30 wars happening all around the world. There are actual genocides happening in Sudan, which I was reading about the other day. There's the killing of the Christians in Nigeria, which sounds pretty bad to me. But if you just looked at the BBC, you wouldn't know about any of these things happening. No. It's like Gaza and Donald Trump are the most important things happening in the entire world to them. And it's because to them, these are the most important things that are happening. But to the normal everyday person, And speaking back to your point before, part of the problem with the BBC being well state funded by forced sort of taxation is that there's no profit mechanism, right? So they don't really have to answer to their audience, because the audience is being forced to pay to listen to it. So it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, at least like GB News, Sky News, and others, like they can't go too overboard on certain things, because they do have to make money, and to make money you have to actually give your audience what it wants to some degree, like at least what they're interested in. The BBC doesn't have that at all, which is why they can just go so insane with so many stories about Gaza and so many stories about Trump. Well, I mean, just go. I'd urge anyone, just go on the BBC homepage now, and I guarantee you there'll be at least 3 or 4 stories about Gaza, 3 or 4 stories about Trump, and maybe 1 or 2 about the UK. And you really have to do some digging to try and find out like what's going on in our actual country.
You're right. I mean, I wake up to BBC Radio 4, the Today program, and it comes on at 6:30. I mean, we're just bringing up the BBC. Trump,
right?
Gaza, yeah. There you go. I mean, proof of what you said, Chris.
Amazing.
I listened to it for about 5 minutes in the morning, from 6:30 to about 6:35, and because it's always going to be the lead story is Gaza. It's going to be something to do with Gaza, or something to do with how bad Trump is, though, or potentially how it's very important that Trump and Putin don't do a deal. That's very important to the BBC this particular week, and of course, Chris, we shouldn't forget the BBC during the COVID. I call it the COVID tyranny years, from 2020 to 2022, 23. The BBC were to the fore in magnifying this whole idea that, you got to hide under the stairs lest this invisible thing is going to take you and everyone out. And, like I look upon the BBC as a sort of, it's an adjunct to the state. It's been weaponized, I think, to give certain governments, not Tory ones, but certainly Labour ones, what they want, which I find pretty disreputable.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, this is the thing I always find interesting when people say, "Oh, it's government propaganda, it's sort of state propaganda," and obviously it is editorially distinct from the government, and this because obviously they support generally the sort of more centre left wing governments, and they'll be more adversarial to the more right wing governments. Not that the Tories were necessarily very right wing, but going back. But nominally they were, and that's sort of all you need at the BBC is just to think that something's right wing to be against it. But yeah, going back to your point about COVID, and I did work at the BBC through COVID, and one of the things, I mean, I'm not a massive fan of Boris Johnson, but one of the things I do remember at the start of the COVID pandemic in sort of March 2020, which is when we first locked down, is that Boris was Boris didn't really want to lock down. From my recollection, and in the end, I think you remember a lot of people would now say, "Oh, we locked down too late. We should have locked down a few weeks earlier." And initially, it was because it seemed like Boris didn't want to, because he was sort of more pro freedom, I think, naturally. And what happened was the media, led by the BBC, essentially bullied the Prime Minister into locking down by just sort of non-stop propaganda that this was like the only thing to do. And in the end, what happened is he just capitulated and then ended up doing it. But there's never any voice on the other side saying, because I think there was a thing about, well, herd immunity. And that's that's a common thing that happens when you get pandemics, is it just sort of goes through the population, and then eventually everyone just gets a natural immunity, and some people will die. Normally they're vulnerable, and hopefully things would work out. And I think initially there was some comms from the government that was what they were going to try.
There was. And
that was just immediately shot down by all of the media. And then the Prime Minister was essentially bullied by the media just by non-stop coverage of like, you're killing people every day. Look at all these people that are dying, and it's your fault because you're not locking down. Essentially just bullied him into doing it. Now, I don't want to be like a massive defender of Boris Johnson, but in that instance, I mean, and he did ultimately capitulate to the media.
He did.
But it's hard not to, and I think this is one of the problems we have in the UK as a whole. And this is one of the problems that I think Nigel Farage will have if he wins the next election, which is he's just going to have non-stop wall-to-wall media coverage, just criticizing everything he does and trying to sort of bully him into what they want to happen all the time. And I think that's what we saw through COVID.
No, I think you're right. I think, I mean, I've always felt that, especially, I mean, we'll call them conservatives. They're not, but the conservatives always seem scared of the BBC. The only conservative I can recall that wasn't was Thatcher, and but they hated her. I mean, I'm sure you know she was their ultimate hate figure. Her and Ronald Reagan, but I found latterly in the last 10, 15 years the right wing politicians as such, and they're not. But you know what I mean? They're all scared. Oh, the BBC's going to run a hit job on us. I mean,
Yeah,
and look at poor old Liz Truss. I mean, she actually almost did something almost half decent, and they crucified her. And they were, Chris, the BBC were to the fore in running all the finance scare stories to trigger the markets to bring her down. So, I
yeah,
mean, sometimes I think, what's the most powerful institution in this government, in this country? Is it the government or is it the BBC?
yeah. Well, it's a good question, and it depends. And it's funny, isn't it? Because I was talking to some friends about this recently. It's how receptive that government is to the media and to the BBC. So, as you were saying, like the Conservatives, and we were talking about this because obviously Starmer, if he had any decency, would have resigned by now, and he would have fired about half the cabinet for all
Yeah.
the cock-ups that they've made. And literally, no one seems to get fired for anything in this government. It doesn't matter what you do. But I was saying to some friends the other day, the Conservatives had the opposite problem, where they would just fire people for breathing incorrectly. If the media came after someone and said, "Oh, this person said this," Rishi would immediately be like, "Right, well, he's fired. Get someone else in." They almost did it too much the opposite way, where they would just, and part of this is, I think, is the whole problem with our politics, is that a lot of it now is just politicians doing the media rounds and not
Yes.
actually running the bloody country. And they're
Yep.
more bothered about what the media is going to say about them on any given day than they are about actually doing their bloody job. And it's
Totally.
like, I thought if I was in government, if I was the prime minister, what I would advice I would give to Nigel Farage would be, or the next prime minister, if you want to do things, if you actually want to get things done, is stop doing media rounds. Do the media like once a week. Give them an update on everything you've done that week. Why? I don't understand why you're constantly having all these people, all these individual MPs who all have their own individual goals to pursue their own careers, to try and advance their own careers, who are trying to boost their own media profile, constantly just going out on the media all the time, and then constantly reacting to the media. The whole thing just becomes media does something, the government reacts, the media, it's just this constant back and forth, media, government, this never ending news cycle of all this bullshit that basically, quite frankly, the next week, most of it's been forgotten anyway. So what's the point? It's just a massive circus.
Well, a good example of that is actually the BBC sort of flagship Sunday morning program with Laura Kuenssberg. And I mean, and sometimes I watch a bit of it just to laugh at it, but particularly I laugh at the conservative type politicians who come on, and they're instantly on the defensive, and you can actually see it. You can see their brains ticking over, and they're desperate not to say anything that might annoy Laura. Rather than my approach would be to absolutely go for the jugular with all of them and see how they like that. But and I would think with Farage as well. Farage is going to get himself into big trouble if he tries to ameliorate Chris. I don't think you can ameliorate the BBC because of what you say. The water that they're in, you can't somehow come to some happy agreement. I don't think you can do that. Do you? I'm talking about Farage.
Not at all. I mean, if you play their game, you'll lose because it's their game. That's how this whole thing works, I think. Because they set these things up. They've got a whole team. And it's not just the BBC. This is all the media in general. They've got they have the whole teams behind it. They all have their own agenda. If it's GB News, it's on the right wing. If it's Sky News or whatever, it's on the left wing. They've all got their own agenda. They've all got their producers. They've all got their presenters, and they're coming up with ideas and ways that they can obviously catch people out. And sometimes that's a good thing. Obviously, that's great. If people are doing stupid things, we do want to catch them out. But sometimes it's a bad thing because you're just chasing this kind of never-ending sort of getting clips, right? Oh, well, this is going to do really well on social media. How can we embarrass them the most and all this kind of stuff? And it just creates this whole sort of circus politics where it's all just about the media and it's all fake. and the actual country is just going to ruin while all of this is happening. And I think, speaking to your point, if you look at like a politician like Donald Trump, for example, and a lot of people don't like Trump, but one of the reasons that I do like Trump is because, you know, politics aside, is because of the way that he talks and the way that he handles the media, because he's not worried about what the media says about him. He's not worried about what the papers are going to say, what the BBC is going to say tomorrow. He just goes and he does what he thinks is correct and what he thinks he's been elected to do. And realistically, that's what we actually need, is a strong politician who actually, first of all, believes in what they say. Whether you agree with it or not, that's fine. But we should have politicians that actually believe what they're saying rather than feeding us lies, and then actually have the balls to actually go out and do it, regardless of what criticism they receive. Because whatever you do, whether you're left wing or you're right wing, and your politician that you like is left wing or right wing, there's always going to be criticism of what they're doing. That's going to happen regardless. You're never going to please anyone. So there's no point in trying. You need to have someone that actually has the balls to go and do these things and then answer questions later, not be running every policy choice by the media first to see if the BBC like it and then we'll do it.
Yeah, because that's never going to happen. I mean, that's why, for example, whenever Trump was in Scotland there a couple of weeks back, and he did that press conference with Starmer, and okay, the world's media was there, but the British media was there, and it was fantastic because Trump just says what he thinks, which is what everyone should do, I think. And he's not filtered, and he's not trying to give an answer that he thinks the journalist asking is going to be happy with. He's not like that. And I would hope that whoever we have in 2029, by the time, assuming we get to 2029, I wonder, they would be much more in that tradition. Because I think when we come back to the BBC, back in 1999, 2000, I started a blog, as they called it back in the day, called Bias BBC. And it's been going 26 years. And the thing that it plugged into even back then, Chris, was there's a lot of people out there who think, hang on, BBC, hang on a second, we're not happy about what you're doing here. You know, the BBC isn't really held to account. And it should be held to account, but it can't be because it doesn't have shareholders. You know, it's got the license tax. So that's what makes it such a peculiar global organization, because its tendrils are all around the world. And so in some regards, actually, BBC, what is it, their overseas service, it's actually worse sometimes than the domestic service, which is, just bring it up there, Jed, is impossible. Yeah, exposing, there's my old blog. It's still going. I don't have anything to do with it anymore. But exposing the broadcasting bias of the BBC, 26 years of it, you know, and people still are interested in that. But yeah, you know, they're not accountable for anything. That's the problem, Chris.
Speaking about sort of BBC World now, and I do. This is one of the sort of things I kind of touched on it before, where there's this sort of philosophical idea of what the BBC could be versus what it actually is in reality. This sort of BBC World service and stuff, and I think they do a lot of good work. They did something a number of years ago, I don't know if you heard about it, where they were sort of sneaking news into North Korea on USB sticks. So the people of North Korea could have access to sort of what was going on in the world and something like that. You know, I'm sure there was some obviously biased BBC news on there, but you know, that's something like that. I think it is quite a cool initiative and thing to do. And it gives the BBC, and I do hate this phrase generally, but it gives the UK this sort of soft power around the world.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
And you know, you go and like, so when I worked at the BBC, a lot of the time, if I told someone in the UK that I worked at the BBC, it was like 50-50 whether they would be impressed or whether they would hate me immediately. But if you go abroad and you speak to anyone and you tell them you work for the BBC, 100% of the time they're like, wow, that's you know, they instantly, it's like you're a doctor, you know, they instantly just have all this respect for you, because they, around the world, the BBC still has this sort of high status and high privilege, you know, brand and view. And I think something like that, you know, for the UK as a country, as like a tool of our country to be good and to have status and privilege around the world, could be really good. And I feel like, unfortunately, as the way that it's been declining in the UK, it's probably only a matter of time before it starts declining around the world as well.
Yeah. I mean, well, that's an interesting point because also the number you talk about the decline of the BBC, Chris, and it's hemorrhaging, licensed taxpayers
Yeah,
and the younger generation. If you ask anyone under the age of 30, they don't watch they don't watch mainstream media
no.
news. They've all gone digital, and I know that from my own kids even, but. So the BBC, there's a sort of an existential crisis there. The people that are watching it probably most religiously is my age.
Yeah.
Although hands up, I don't. But most of the and so ultimately at some point the BBC's going to get in real trouble, don't you think? In terms of
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And I remember, I don't know, I don't know if anything came of this, but I think a few months ago there was talk of somehow making people pay the license fee if they only watch Netflix, or if they watch YouTube, you'd have to pay the license fee, which is obviously just absurd. And
yeah.
I think if they actually did try to implement that, people would start massively kicking off. I mean, it's already
Mhm.
ridiculous that if
Mhm.
you only watch Sky, for example, you still have to pay for the BBC, which is obviously crazy
Wow.
anyway.
Yeah.
So you're right. There's definitely a big problem coming down the line. I don't know what they're going to do about it. To be honest, like there's a big funding gap there. They've already been trying to make cuts. In my opinion, going back to sort of what we were saying before, it's that they focus on the wrong thing and they cut the wrong things. In my opinion, if
Mm.
you're going to have a sort of a state broadcaster, it should just be a lean thing that does what the private sector can't do. I don't see what the point is in funding something that's competing with private
Yeah.
interests because that already exists. What's the point? If you want to have a state broadcaster, you should just fund it out of general taxation and have it just doing the things that aren't serviced already.
Yeah.
That why would the government be paying to compete with Sky and GB News and
No
ITV,
worry.
who are private companies? It just seems
No.
stupid to me. Meanwhile, local news, things that most people actually care about in their day to day, which is like what's happening in their local area, is just completely fallen by the wayside, and no one seems to be talking about that at all, which to
Mm.
me is a big concern, because that is what people care about the most. The average normal working class day to day person doesn't really care about politics at all, let alone in the UK, let alone the politics of the US or Israel. So to me, that's a massive problem, and something that's not being serviced. So
Yeah.
the BBC's screwed, and it's also not doing what it should be doing, in my opinion.
I mean, I happened to watch a report on the BBC. Is it the 9 o'clock news, 10 o'clock news? And they had put a reporter and his team had infiltrated some of the migrant camps in the north of France, and
Mm-hmm.
they actually ran this for like 10 minutes, primetime news, and actually it was pretty good. And this reporter, they were basically showing how the gangs get them across the channel and the whole mechanisms. And I'm watching this thinking, well, this is public service. This
Yeah.
is showing the thing that the government doesn't want us to talk about, Chris, and it's actually showing how it works, and it's not really that good for the government. And I thought, well, just for a second there, just for 10 minutes, that was almost useful, but then it doesn't go anywhere. Like that's just the end of it. So there are obviously some decent journalists still trying to do jobs within the BBC in
Yeah.
2025.
Well, that is what's kind of a shame about the whole thing is that when the BBC is actually at its best, it does do some very very good work. Some of the best work. It's done some of the best documentaries, as you say. It does do really good reporting when it's not politicized. That's the whole issue. And I
Problem.
think because
Yeah.
of the modern era now, things have become so much more polarized than ever before that it's becoming harder and harder to not be politicized. And the people who are into the news and news savvy are
Yeah.
just immediately aware of how the BBC is being biased. So it's
Yeah.
kind of crashing its reputation because it's this, people are like this with anything, right? The negative things stick in your mind much more than positive things. So all it takes is the BBC to piss you off once or twice or three times, and then that's it. You've lost all of respect for them. Doesn't matter how many good documentaries they then go out and do. They've already
Mm.
established in your mind that they report biasly, and then you
Yeah.
basically can't even if you think something's good in your mind, you're still going, well, what are they missing out here? Because they've already lost that trust with you, and once you've lost the trust, you basically can't get it back.
It's impossible. I sat and watched a David Attenborough program on the BBC on nature, on to do with
Mhm.
the relationships animals have with each other. Really, and I watched it all, and it was beautifully shot. And yes, the narration was fine, and I was enjoying like 50 minutes of it. It was really good. And then, and it's just so sickening. You knew what was going to be coming, and that was, and you know, I'll not do a David Attenborough impersonation, but there was the inevitable spoiler alert: climate change, and they couldn't let it be. You know what I mean? Just talk about bloody animals. I don't want to hear about climate change because I know you're biased in that,
Yeah.
but. You know, so it's insidious. Maybe they can't help themselves. Maybe to them, this is when they produce these, like Attenborough. You know,
Well, that
they can't resist it.
yeah, I was going to say that that's kind of a good example that speaks to what we were talking about earlier about the fish in the water,
Yeah,
because in that example, now I don't know too much about climate change, the arguments for and against. I do know that obviously there are arguments for and against,
yeah,
but if
both.
you
Yeah,
listen to but if you listen to the BBC, you wouldn't realize that there are any arguments against the idea
they
of
are.
man-made
Yeah,
climate change or climate change as a whole, because
yeah,
to them it's this idea of it's settled science, right? They always use that fact of
which it
like
is. Yeah, yeah,
97% of scientists agree or whatever. So, but this shows you how the bias can work, because they have an obligation in their charter to give impartiality to all views. But the fact that they can, at the end of a David Attenborough documentary, put in just one side of the argument about climate change and not give
yeah.
the other side. I don't think I've ever heard the other side on any sort of mainstream
No,
media channel. And the reason
no.
that they don't do that is because they don't feel like they have to, because in their worldview, that is the settled argument. You know, the argument is sort of over. That's the water now that they now live in. And you can just translate that over to the sort of basic ideas of politics to
Yeah,
see how their bias works there as well. And it's always this, center left sort of ideology, like, oh, cutting spending, cutting benefits, or reforming the NHS, or controlling immigration, or any of these ideas are just completely insane to them. They don't even feel like they have to give the other side of the argument a lot of the time, because to them that is also this sort of settled science.
mm. Yeah, yeah. It's an all pervasive argument that they use. Basically, in essence, it's their worldview, Chris. Let's be honest.
Mm.
It is the BBC worldview, and because they're so, I mean, they are. They're still a very strong organisation with a lot of reach. I mean, it used to be that local media had good local reach, but that's all faded away. But then again, of course, we see the rise of the internet, the digital space, and I was amused to see that I think the BBC are pondering not just getting their content onto YouTube, but forcing YouTube to carry their content. You see that
Yeah.
where there's so to me that's good because that reeks of desperation actually. But what do you think of that idea that they had? That
Yeah, well, I did think that was quite funny, because when I started working for the BBC about 8 years ago, and that was one of the first things I said, because I've been on YouTube since 2007, like 2006.
Mhm.
YouTube is like my main go-to for media ever since it sort of started. I've been sort of
Yeah,
YouTube native. So when I first got into media and into BBC, I was like, why is none of the BBC stuff on YouTube? Like, I remember speaking to people about this. I was like,
yeah.
you should put the stuff on YouTube. Like, you could make some money for the organization. There's literally nothing to lose by doing that. And you just get, oh, we can't do all this, that, and the other. And then obviously now, 10 years later, like with everything, the BBC arrives to about 10 years beyond when they should have actually done it in the first place.
Mm.
Always late to the party kind of thing. I think it's probably too little, too late for them now, to be honest. But yeah, you're right. It does sort of reek of desperation. But the whole point of places like YouTube and the internet, and you see this, and the BBC is also, as I was sort of coming to the end of my tenure at the organization, they're having this big push now to be more online. Again, probably about 15 years later than they should have made that switch.
Yeah,
Now we're focusing online in
yeah.
2024. Now is the time to focus. I've heard the internet's going to be a big thing, guys, in
Yes,
2024.
yeah.
But they go to this, they go to this big push on the internet, and I think it's just a little bit too late for them now, and it's not the space for them. You see all the media organizations, the internet now, and what Elon said about X, for example. We
Yeah,
are the media
we're the
now.
media. Yeah, Yeah.
The internet is not the place for these organizations. These are the old world organizations. These are the legacy media. There's not really a place for them there, because people who are online are aware, and they're online for a reason, because they're aware of how these curated narratives are made on the mainstream. And yes, there are problems with online as well. There's ridiculous lies and conspiracy theories and all these kind of things. But it's the place for that. It's the place for the open discussion and the open narrative. And with that, you do get misinformation, of course. But with the BBC, you get disinformation anyway. So, you know, pick your poison.
So tell us, Chris. So you've moved on from the BBC. So tell us about what your plans are and what you're hoping to do going forward.
Yeah. So now I'm an independent journalist now. So I'm just doing my own thing, really. On X, you can give me a follow at Chris Mid. I've been writing. Thank you very much. I've been writing lots of in-depth threads on various different topics, trying to make people informed, really, focusing on sort of my areas that I like to talk about, which is kind of free speech, media bias, as we've been talking about, government overreach, government lies, that sort of thing. You know, I did a degree in philosophy before I did my degree in journalism. For me, I've always just had a love of the truth. I'm a truth seeker, if you want to say. That's why I wanted to become a journalist. You know, and that's you know, that's, to me. I know it doesn't seem like that's what a lot of journalism is now, but in my sort of idyllic view when I was younger, I thought that's what journalism was all about. You know, and that's what I think it should be, holding power to account and exposing lies. And now we find that a lot of the lies come from the media. So that's part of what I do, exposing the BBC, exposing other media, talking about free speech issues, and doing various bits of writing here and there, and just trying to get myself out there and get some pennies to buy some food.
Yeah, well, you're doing a great job, Chris. You did a great job last Christmas as well. And you know, frankly, we need many more people like you with the right attitude. I mean, seeking truth is ultimately what we're all should be trying to do. I think those of us who operate within this particular sphere, and it's good that you're doing that. So look, I don't know if you're going to have a record this Christmas or not, a download, but whatever you're going to do, Chris, I wish you every success in it. Can I urge everyone, do make sure you follow Chris over on his X there. There's good content that he puts out all the time, and he deserves a lot more people. So please go and support Chris.
Thanks very much.
On X. And as I say, Chris, thanks for all that you're doing, and thanks for being with us this evening. All that remains for me to do this evening is to do my usual piece here. So look, thanks everybody for wherever you've been watching this. I see all your comments. I see as far away as Hawaii, Chris. We've got Hawaiians.
Wow. Aloha.
Aloha, indeed, one of my regulars all the way over from the wonderful Hawaiian island chain. Lovely part of the world. Thank you for watching us this evening. Don't forget, tune in tomorrow. Podcasts go out, Substacks go out, all that kind of malarkey, plus all the stuff on X. So look, thank you very much for supporting us. From Chris and myself for tonight, it's good night.